Hi everybody, this video is to help us set up ratios for sine, cosine, and tangent and help us understand a little bit more about them. Sine is a ratio or comparison of the opposite side divided by the hypotenuse. Cosine is the adjacent side divided by the hypotenuse, and tangent is the opposite side divided by the adjacent. So if we don't know what a hypotenuse or opposite or adjacent side are, we clearly can't do these. So the previous video explained how to label in a very simple manner. One side note we can notice is that tangent is really the opposite side, which is the one sine uses, divided by the adjacent, which is the one cosine uses. So you'll learn in higher math that that tangent of x is really equal to sine of x divided by cosine of x. So we really have only two. The third one, tangent, is a combination of the first two. So that's just a side note. In order to begin to set these up, we need to have an angle that we're using. We call this our reference angle. So let me use A as a reference angle. We're going to imagine standing there. So you can imagine this is the angle you're referring to. If you were standing at angle B, that would be your reference angle. In the previous video, we explained it's usually a good idea to set up the hypotenuse first because it'll never change. So let me put some numbers here and then we can label. So the first thing I recommended labeling was your hypotenuse because your hypotenuse never changes. The second thing we would label is we would look at our reference angle where we're standing and label the opposite of that, which would be 40. Finally, the adjacent side is the one that's left over. It's the one next to the reference angle. Adjacent sort of means next to. So you could just label the one left over as adjacent. You really don't need to remember that, but it might help. So now we can begin to do our references and set up our ratios. Sine of x, and it's important to note that the angle will always go next to the word sine, cosine, or tangent. If it's a number, the number will go there. If it's a variable, the variable goes there. So sine is going to equal, as we see up here, our opposite side. So here it would be 40 divided by our hypotenuse. Cosine of x being our reference angle, would be the adjacent side. Our adjacent number is 30 divided by the hypotenuse. The third one is tangent of the angle x will equal the opposite side divided by the adjacent side. So now in the next videos we will show how in this case, for example, we can get x alone by doing the inverse, and our calculator will give us the missing angle. Let's take a quick look at another one so we can see how where you stand matters and will determine what your opposite and adjacent sides are. So now let's take this right triangle, and instead of using the top angle, we'll use the bottom one. So my reference angle this time will be angle B. I'm going to label my hypotenuse. Let me give us some numbers here. My hypotenuse is 50. It's across from the right angle. My reference angle is angle x. So opposite of that would be here. And the one next to it, the reference angle, and the one left over is our adjacent. So one thing that students have been taught for many, many years to help them remember sine, cosine, and tangent is a mnemonic, SOH CAH TOA. And SOH CAH TOA is simply helping us remember that sine, get a highlighter, sine is the opposite side divided by the hypotenuse. Cosine is the adjacent side divided by the hypotenuse. And tangent is the opposite side divided by the adjacent. SOH CAH TOA. And you may want to exaggerate the H. SOH CAH TOA. And it's kind of funny, once we teach these to students, they go around saying, suck a toe. So now that we're on the bottom, our opposite is 30. So we'll say sine of x, the angle, will equal 30 over 40. Cosine of x will equal the adjacent, or 40, over 50. Oh, let's go back a moment. That's good. The 30 was our opposite, and I accidentally put the adjacent there, so we really want our hypotenuse. Cosine of x is our adjacent over our hypotenuse, a over h. So that would be 40 over 30. And tangent would be our opposite over our adjacent. So our opposite would be 30, and our adjacent would be 40. One thing to notice is when we stood down here, the opposite was 30. So it was on top for tangent. When we were standing on angle A, the 40 was opposite. So another side note is that if you take this triangle and you have x and y, what's interesting is sine of y would be the same as cosine of x. And we'll take a look at that by labeling. Our hypotenuse is here, 10, opposite of y would be, let's make a number 6, and then opposite of the x would be 8. So without labeling everything, sine of y would be the opposite, which is 6, over the hypotenuse, which would be 10. Cosine would be angle x we're using. So the opposite would be, cosine is, again, I'm making that mistake, adjacent over hypotenuse. Sorry, I got distracted. There was a phone ringing in the background. So adjacent in this case, if we're standing here, opposite would be 8, so adjacent would be 6. And the hypotenuse would be 10. So it's sort of interesting that when you reverse sides, sine and cosine sort of reverse. They're related because they're simply ratios. If it's opposite over hypotenuse, well, when we move over here, the adjacent is the same number as when we were standing here for opposite. That's not too important for solving, but hopefully this helps you understand how to set up a sine, cosine, and tangent ratio.